now we're getting into the more technical part of the day. Again, stop me when I get to any concepts you're not familiar with or want to learn a little bit more about. I'm not going to give you a full HL7 training because I'm not that qualified in HL7 to be able to give that kind of training. But there are training courses on HL7. You just have to decide whether that's a path you want to go down. And there's some considerations for it. So do you really need to understand it, the HL7 aspects? Well, I'd say it depends. It depends on you. It depends on your organization. It depends on what else you're involved with. For a basic implementation of the standard, you probably don't need to understand the HL7 ISO model or understand why the schemas are structured like that. With the supporting documentation of the reference instance, the business rules documents, the implementation guides, you can probably do an implementation without having to understand why it's that way. So you can do an implementation without going into the full detail. But there are situations where having a full understanding of it will be advantageous. So if you're reporting data to other regulators or in other domains such as veterinary or devices, having the understanding of the underlying message will help you have an implementation which would cover all domains, and then it's just the interface that you restrict for the domain. So the person data entering will be entering information for a pharmacovigilance situation, so they'll have the screens associated with that. The underlying message model database design would cover all the aspects, but when it comes to messaging, you would only choose the pieces that are relevant. So FDA vaccine reporting, device reporting I mentioned earlier, these are things where having a good understanding of the underlying message model would help you because you'll be using core components that are repeatable. I know that some organizations have a E2B plus. There's some sort of, I've heard this rumor around that. I'm not familiar with it, I've never seen it, but there's some extensions, that have happened in the past to R2 to support some additional use cases. You could fully incorporate those in R3. It's extensible. You can just add them in. But don't add them in the wrong place. Otherwise, it could cause confusion and processing issues. And don't do additions unless you know where you're adding the information. You could plug it in the wrong place, and then you'll have an HL7 person coming screaming at you for being, why are you doing it that way? It's completely wrong. It's better to have a good understanding of the data model to know where the most appropriate place to put these extensions are. Don't have to listen to me, but it's up to you. Okay, so for HL7 models, I'm just going to show you. So if you go into the ISO standard, I'll show you that first. Just have to navigate to the right place. So, assuming you spent 213 Swiss francs, or whatever it is now, it changes, so it used to be at 253, so it's a bit cheaper at the moment. This is the document that you get. You'll see all these sections. Most of this is the ISO standard template, so there's a lot of scope, introduction, and abbreviations. Had a lot of fun writing these sections, so you can ignore them, please. The HL7 part came directly from HL7 and is sat within the ISO template. And how you access the HL7 content is coming to section 5. And you'll immediately see the typeface changes slightly, and this is all HL7 documentation. Just have to allow content. If you come down, you can read that if you like, but you don't really need it. The important thing is this. This is the model, and it's all clickable. Clicking on the model opens it up. And then from there, you have the entry point to reading the model. So you come in here, and you have this thing called investigation event, and then you have all these wonderful things coming off of it. I'm going to describe that in a little bit, not much detail, so it can help you read this. But the other thing to note is that you can just click anywhere on the model and it will take you to a more detailed description of what that block represents in terms of fields. And then you can drill down further. You can even drill onto the data types, and it takes you to the information on that data type. It's a huge amount of information in here. But everything is linked up, so you can go through and really understand the detailed data types, what makes up a valid data type. Everything's documented here. It's a huge wealth of information that most of you will not need or want to understand, but it's there. It's just to show that it's all there. So coming back, what will those colors mean? So you have acts, which sort of, in most cases in ICSR, are events. So you have this mood code called ENV. So these pink or slightly more red boxes are called acts. So things like substance administration, which is what the class code here is, an event that happens to someone. You also have these relationships between two things happening. So at the bottom one, you have a supply event. That's what the split means. Something has been given to someone and administered to them. That's entities are people or things. And there's a role played by those things within those events. So it's and there's a relationship between two roles when things are happening together. And I'll not go into that detail. So using a simple, relatively simple example, you have Dr. Smith had an appendectomy today. There's an entity called Jane Smith. So that's a person who, so starting on the right-hand side, there's a person who has some attributes, a person name, so there's a data type for person name, Jane Smith, playing the role of a patient who is the subject of a procedure event. And that has an ID and a code, which is probably for the appendectomy. There's probably some coding system used. So from looking at the model, you have all these things related together. But you could also have the person playing a different role, and this time they're playing the role of doctor who's performing the procedure, hopefully not on themselves, but so you can reuse these entities and roles, and just by changing them slightly, by filling in the information, you can provide different data. So it's reusing the same concepts over and over again. So you'll see all this techno-color going across the screen, and it's all there for a reason, but it does lead to some very interesting XML. So just to show you, I put a little walkthrough. So if you want to know more, it's probably take at least a day to go through it. But we'll just have a quick walkthrough of how to look at this. So this is the entry point into the model. So the XML starts generating from this point of view. There's an investigation event which has an effective time, availability time. So these are this is the administrative information. You have an ID, which is the worldwide case ID for this event. So this is all captured at this level. With it, you have an investigation event. So there's something associated with this investigation, because there's different types of investigation. I won't go into the detail. But if you come over to the left, during that investigation event, you have a subject, someone that's been looked at, and they had a role within it. I mean, the person's captured over here, but it's also captured onto the left here. And when you come here, this actually rolls out into another section. So there's a lot of events or observations that happen to the patient during this investigation. Some of the events are the patient's been given some drugs. So some of the drug information is captured as a substance administration. And if I roll down to here, we have the product. This is the product information. So the information about the product that was given to the patient. Then you have the concept of instance of kind. So not all products are the same. Well, a product can, how best to describe this? I suppose if not all cars are Fiats, but my specific Fiat has a license plate number 1234 and its model number XYZ. So a specific instance of the car is my car with a license plate number, but not all Fiats have the same license plate number. So you have a kind of product, so that describes all the Fiat 500s or Grande Puntos, and then you have a specific instance which is involved with that person. So this is the box off the shelf of the pharmacy. So there's a difference between an instance and a kind. So that's captured within here. So you'll see this concept of instance and kind of products throughout the model. You also have some observations performed against the patient. And I'll just have to tell you, this is where the observations of reactions and things are captured up through this part of the model. So this is a very busy part of the model, and this is called the patient statement. So in HL7, this is one of the core representations of information about what happens to a patient in clinical care. If you look at the, hopefully, I just need to log in to my desktop. If you look at the schema instance, that translates into quite complicated HL7 XML. I'll just see if I can. It's not letting me zoom in, I'm afraid. So let's see if there's any way of doing it. Because I'm remoting to my desktop, I can't really show you. But you have to navigate a long way through the structure to be able to find. So if I come down, flicking between the model, the investigation event comes in within the message here. So we're already, the reason why we're so far down in the message is outside of this is a big envelope, and the envelope is called the transmission wrapper. So when you look at this model, you're not here at the start at the XML. You've got this other thing which enables a message to be created. So the batch wrapper is another set of bits of XML that stick on top of it. And you'll see this is PORR, RM, and that's the domain of the adverse drug reaction reporting form. Yeah, so I'm just being asked if I pause here, because I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's if you have specific questions, then it might not be the correct forum, but it's just to show you that the XML is related to the model. So you have all the information coming off from this point down is represented here. So you'll see the investigation events and everything else will be at this level of the model. It is very difficult to begin with. I'm not joking. It took me a long time to understand all this. And maybe if you're more used to UML or you've done V3 messaging before, this is, yeah, it's straightforward. But if you want to get really into understanding why the XML looks like this, you have to take the model and you have to take the reference instance and work it out and go through it. You don't need to do this. You might be causing your own suffering on this, but you don't have to do this. With the reference instance, you have all the fields identified, so you can search through it. You can have a look at the patterns and how it's structured to be able to generate this XML. Yes.
One question. How stable is the implementation at the moment? The 1% in the implementation guide, will it change, or how?
Our reference instance will not change for a long time because we have
No new fields and things like that.
Because to revision the EU implementation guide, it will have to go through the scientific committees. There has to be some sort of business need, a legal, or probably, if there's a legal change, then there'll be a business need change. Then we have to go through the analysis phase, update the implementation guide, go through public consultation, finalize the document, publish it. That process usually takes a minimum of a year to do a revision. And people will say, well, we need an implementation phase for these changes. So you'll be looking at 3 years before you have to implement anything specifically from a revision. Unless it's very, very minor, it takes a long time to get that kind of change because it has to go through a long process. So I don't think the EU implementation guide is changing anytime soon, unless you know of legislation that's coming our way. So I don't want to scare you too much with that, but is there any questions on how to use the ISO models, HL7 models, and explaining why the XML looks like this? I'm not going to spend more time on this, but unless you really want it.
Nick, any suggestions for troubleshooting? I mean, many of us are conversant in R2. We can work out why a message has failed. Would it be is it going to be as easy, or when we have R3 transmissions, to look at why they're failing?
Well, most of the failure should be on the business rules, but I'll come back to showing some challenges related to because the ICH logical model says a field is not repeatable, but let's take an example. Patient medical report number. What happens? Logical model says it only appears once. I just accidentally copied it. I'll just validate it. Oh, look, it's fine. That's one of the challenges. Because the logical model says it's one thing, but the messaging model allows something else. So you have to build in mind that you need some pre-processing rules that checks that someone didn't do this. I'll come back on how you can do that later on. But just because the logical model says it's once doesn't mean the messaging model obeys that. Because the way it's designed is that you have these code systems that can be used for different types of observation or collecting different information. So the difference between these is through the object identifier. There's no rule to say you can't reuse an object identifier, because in a lot of cases in HL7 messaging, you're using the same object identifier. Say Medra has an object identifier. You wouldn't restrict to use one Medra code in the whole ICSR. You need to use it in multiple places. The same principle applies to observations. You need to allow multiple observations. But we're not expecting the same observation, like the patient height and weight, which you can also repeat, to be there multiple times. So one of the things you need to think about is when you're receiving data from someone else, have they applied the right rules? And how do you control for that? So, okay, I'm starting to worry you. I hope I don't upset your stomachs for lunch. But
I have a question. So apart from the reference instance and the model, does ICH or EMA publish some classes as well? Let's say you were talking about this is implemented in Java. So are there class instances that are shared as well that can be used by system implementers?
We don't publish anything. We do have logical, physical, and messaging models and the mappings between those, but not public domain documents at this stage. I mean, physical model wouldn't give you anything. There is perhaps between the logical model and the messaging model, mappings could be useful, but there's no publication of those planned. But something we can think about. But we're not, no. Okay. Right, so some suggested reading. If you want to get into the detail of this, if you really want to understand it, particularly those that I said, if you're doing extensions to it, or if you've got reporting requirements to other domains, you're probably going to have to do the work of understanding this at a greater level. And if you want to do that, or you like the punishment, then these are the documents that you'll need to help you. So get a copy of the ISO standard, and then there's some HL7 books which will help you interpret much better than I can explain the messaging models and particularly the code systems. And so I've read these books. They're good. One of them's about this thick. It's a very, very small book, but it does have a lot of information in there. It took me 5 times reading it to understand any of it, but once you get there, then it helps. Okay, here be dragons. I might have already mentioned some assumptions that you might have that will cause you problems. The ICH logical model and the HL7 model are identical. No, they're not. I just showed you an example. Logical model says the field is not repeatable. Messaging model says, yeah, you can repeat it. Why not? Okay. You can use the backwards forwards conversion rules to migrate your database. Please don't. I'll show you why later, but bad idea. Don't use the rules. If you use the Excel spreadsheet that explains how to do the conversion, that can give you a good pointer on some scientific discussion on the best approach, but you'll probably come up with a much more elegant solution. Whether you want to go for a canonical model that sort of represents both data in R2 and R3 format within your transactional system, and then let your data analysis system do the decisions on how to interpret that. Could be one way of doing it. Or you could decide where there's a common concept, you have to make a business decision whether the concept in R2 and R3 is the same. And the BSC rules Excel spreadsheet could help drive that discussion. But you need to have that discussion. Don't just say, oh, we'll just drop it in and it'll process, and I've got a database that's now R3. Yeah, I'll show you why later. Oh, the other one is XPaths can easily be made for each data element. You need to have some thought about XPaths. The technical document has lots and lots of restrictions in it. And those restrictions assume that the person sending you the ICSR has followed all of them to the letter. The XSD doesn't require all the elements that are quoted in the XPaths. So you may end up saying, oh, there's no data there. But if you open the file, it's there. It's just your XPath said not to bother. It said don't find it because you added something that the sender didn't populate. I'll show you again where I found that. You can use the R2 to R3 conversion to load R2 into your R3 system. Again, I don't advise that at all. There are bugs in it, and there are peculiarities which will mean that the way you process the data with the conversion tool might not be best suited to represent the information in your database. It may be better to do a specific mapping between the R2 message coming into your new database R3 model and making decisions on how to load the data and how to store the data. The conversion will do some irreparable changes to the data, which means that you're forced to store that data and you've converted it and you have lost the original source. So it's usually better to make that decision at the ETL into the data analysis system. You can always change your mind later on. You haven't done a one-way conversion and relied on that being correct for all time. I'll pause there. Anyone want to challenge me on that? No, okay. There are differences between the logical model and the messaging model. So the logical model in ICH says you do it this way for drug reaction assessments. So underneath the drug section, you find the assessments. But when you look at the messaging model, the assessments are in a completely different location. So how can it be so the drugs are here. So the XML generating information about the drugs is here. And the assessments are off this way. So the messaging model and the logical model don't agree with each other. Just to give you an example. The way that the HL7 message works is that each drug is given a unique reference, a UUID, unique identifier. And each reaction is given a unique identifier. And that allows you to do a many-to-many type combination of each drug with each reaction and have multiple assessments by different parties on the causality of that. So the logical model is not necessarily how you'll find the data within the actual message. And it may not be the way that you want to store it in your database. You might want to take the logical model and design your physical model based on that logical model, because you need to look at the messaging, how you're collecting the data, to see if it actually works. This one caused quite a lot of discussion. We had a lot of headache over this, didn't we, Yassine? And it also, how you convert the R2 data into this new structure is a challenge. I won't gloss over that one. So you need to look at these kind of things. There's a question, yeah.
Yeah, at this point, because I think that was also part of one question I had, is what is meant by reference here? Because in R2 it was mainly the MADRA code and the product, and then you repeated it as often as you needed it to have all combinations of product and event. And when I first read it, I thought, where the hell is the MADRA code? And what is this ID about? And who does generate this ID? My safety system creating the message, or?
I'll come back to UUIDs. I'll just say that at message creation, you assign it. We'll look at some of the pros and cons of storage and usage of UUIDs, but when you create the message, you need to populate the drug reaction with a unique identifier, and then for any cross-referencing, they need to go in this section to say this is an assessment. Also, the drug classification, I believe, is also following this kind of thing. Is an observation on the substance administration, and it uses this ID to link it. So it's not the only one. XPath. This is, I had a discussion with the Spanish authority, because they're very active at the moment, and we were looking through the XPath, and they kept telling me my reference instance doesn't match the XPath. I'm saying my reference instance is fine. Then we looked into the XPath published by ICH, and for this example, there's a field free text comments, and the logic business rule in the ICH documentation says you don't always have to provide a Medra-coded field for this. You can just provide the free text name. So there's some sort of rule that allows free text names to be used within it. But when you look at the XPath statement published, you'll see a reference to a code system called Medra. So when you're generating the file, you probably haven't put in a blank section called code and reference Medra when there is no Medra code to go along with the code system. But because the XPath is expecting that field to appear when it shouldn't have to appear, you're not going to find these test names, these free text test names. So XPaths can be, you have to really think about it and what the sender of the data to you, if you're trying to read data, what the sender of the data could do wrong. Because within the XSD, the schema, some attributes don't have to be populated. If you're an HL7 purist, you should, element names mean nothing. You should go by the attributes only. But when people implement, they always implement the name and then forget about the attributes. Particularly if the schema says they're not mandatory. So what you'll find is things like performer, there's a type code for performer equals PRF. But a valid message just could contain the word performer as the element. Organization, class code, category, mood code, env are the attributes that can be put with an organizer data element. But your XML file could just contain organizer. And when you look back at this, you'll see all sorts of, you'll see these, oops. You'll see the references here to organizer and class code category. So again, this XPath would not find data underneath this element because it's expecting this. So the question to you, do you pre-process the UTB-R3 file and add in all the missing attributes? That's one way you could do it. Or could you, the other option is generalize the XPath to account that there are optional attributes and they won't always be present, depending on who you're exchanging data with. I would probably go for the latter more because it's simpler to implement. But it just shows you need to think about, if you're using XPath to extract data from these messages, that you need to really think about whether that attribute is mandatory or not. You can go to the reference instance. And then for a given attribute, you'll see, if you have XML Spy or other tool, you just need to look whether those attributes are mandatory. For some, there is a requirement that there is that field, and then for others, it will tell you whether it's mandatory or not. So you need to look at the reference instance, look at the schema validating rules for that. And so when you build your XPath, you take that into account. So if you have a tool like this, you can create the XPath, but you need to check through the XPath you're creating to see if you've included optional attributes which won't be always present. Okay, that's one of the big gotchas that you might get. Okay, hopefully I've scared you enough to think about these things. I'll come back with more solutions, hopefully, or suggestions later on with some other aspects. So when you're starting this work, if you're already down the road, fantastic. But if you're initiating things, you need to think about creating logical, physical, and messaging models and doing mappings between them. It took quite a lot of work. Don't underestimate the amount of time that you have to spend on this. It helps if you have someone in your group that's familiar with HL7. That will speed things up, but you need to plan enough time to think about this. You also, if you're changing a physical system from one to another, if you're just creating one from scratch, you're in better condition because you don't have to deal with legacy data and migrating the data between two physical models. But if you do it, the best way is at a database level, don't use the backwards forwards conversion tool, please. I wouldn't recommend it. Some considerations for doing that migration of data: drug reaction relatedness and time intervals are one areas that you need to really think about. Code system mappings between R2 and R3. Most of the codes line up nicely, but there are some challenges there. And the BFC Excel rules, use as help, not as gospel. Please don't use it as the only way of doing something. There's a lot of discussion at ETB, Expert Working Group, and generating these as trying to help you guys. But it's not the only way you can do it. So when to use the backwards forwards conversion tool? You can create test R3 files for your development work. There are bugs in it, so beware. Report them to me if you find them, please, and I'll address them if you do find any. And you can use it as survival mode, really, for when we implement centralized reporting in Europe and you're extracting the data from user vigilance, and you need to load it into your R2 system. That's one of the main use cases. Store the R3 files, because then you can reprocess them later when you have an E2B R3 supporting system. So you always have the original source information. You can upload those into your system to get the extra structure, to get the extra data elements which the conversion lost. Because the conversion is not lossless. You'll lose a lot of things into unstructured fields. So case narrative. And you may also have issues that the case narrative, suddenly, you don't have space to store it all. So it's another consideration on the conversion tool doesn't necessarily truncate the case narrative. You need to think how to handle case narratives over 20,000 characters. Maybe you can already do it, but the conversion tool won't solve that for you unless you put in a truncation. Once you put a truncation, you've lost some of the data. So beware. I would not use, personally, the conversion tool to load R2 data into an R3 system. I think that's it's a quick fix, but it will get you in trouble. You're going to find you're losing data, or data's getting converted in a funny way and not stored correctly. If you want to do, I'd leave that for the ETL and your data analysis system to make decisions. You can change those decisions without losing the source data. And don't plan to be in survival mode for 5 years, please. And I would advise you against calling your system R3 compliant if you have to use any form of conversion. Your system is R3 compliant if you can process them natively without using conversion rules. So I would avoid those kind of things. But that's personal opinion. Okay. Kind of back on track a little bit. But questions at this stage? Or I scared you and put you off your lunch? You're very quiet. You asked me lots of questions during session one. Now you don't talk to me. Okay, well, we finished 1 minute ahead of schedule. So sure you don't want to ask questions? Okay.
Certifying user vigilance R3, like R2 we have 10 scenarios. For R3 as well, the same scenarios we need to send it and get the certification.
Yeah, we'll come back to testing, but the same sort of process will apply, is that we'll give you the R3 files, assuming you can load R3 files into your system. You load them up, export them, and send them back to us. And then we'll use kind of like an XDiff or XML difference to check where the changes have occurred. Some changes should have occurred, so receipt dates and receive dates should change because you shouldn't just copy the date that we provided you. Other things should not change. So we'll look for those and see the construction of the XML file to make sure that information hasn't been lost or hidden away somewhere where we can't access it anymore. So the idea will be to use the same approach as before. But if you can't import files, we'll give you files that you have to we can give you the reporting form, a PDF, human readable form that you can key into your system. And then we can discuss about typos during the end of the testing. But again, we would expect the information to come back structured, but we prefer that version of testing less because it's more down to data entry errors usually than it is about the system complying with R3 or R2. So we prefer to give you the file to upload, but if you're not designing your system to import files because you don't receive data from anyone else, then fine, we can do that testing, though we prefer not to. Okay.
One other one, perhaps you lost me on the way and I misinterpreted, but you said that the BFC tool cannot help us with, for example, an R3 which has an 80,000 character narrative. What will it do?
It will just put it all in the narrative field.
All of it?
Yeah.
Oh, so it does not in any way look at field length or something?
It does for the other fields. So if there's a field, it will truncate it and then put a copy of it in the case narrative. That's what the ICH E2B backwards forwards conversion rules state. So it follows the rules stated in the Excel spreadsheet.
So it's just the narrative field that has this exception?
Yeah, it's the narrative field that's going to cause the issue, and it's one to be aware of. I mean, you could add the truncation rule in yourself, but then you might want to have another XSLT to put the excess narrative into another file that you can store separately. So you might need to do some additional work. Okay. I think we've all learned lunch. Okay, one more.
Suppose EMI will go for R3 implementation in September, and company still uses R2 format. Will there be impact on signal detection if company still uses R2 format and EMI is supporting R3?
So in September, that's just the test system, XComp. It's not production. Production doesn't happen until July next year.
Okay.
So
yeah, suppose everything is in place and EMI is live with R3, and still companies are submitting R2 messages format. Will it not have impact on scientific data?
if you look at the fields used for statistical analysis, it's drug reaction patient reporter and some of the administrative fields. Those aren't changing between R2 and R3 in terms of structure. So the majority of signal detection is run off that data set. When you do the analysis, if you want to do more detailed analysis, then you need the additional fields. And as part of that analysis, you need to take into account that some of the data are structured in different ways. So for routine signal detection, there's no real impact of sending an R2 and R3. It's processed the same. It goes in the same fields, the same database. There's no change in, because the cardinality hasn't changed.
Okay.
So it doesn't affect anything really.
Thanks.